In a previous segment, we looked at how the form of design contributes to the overall interest and the multi-season interest of a landscape. In this particular situation, we have the curve of the fence mimicking the curve of the path. This encloses the open space of the turf, and that is further enhanced by the large overstory trees that enframe the gazebo behind us. We now want to take a little closer look at how some of the specific plant materials in the hardscapes contribute to this overall landscape quality. One of the things we think of first when we think of plants contributing to the winter landscape is evergreens. And we have all sorts of things we can choose from, including some of the broadleaf evergreens, which are really a little bit on the edge of their hardiness in Nebraska. We can also look at evergreens for different ways of management, and they're going to contribute differently. Behind us, as a backdrop, we have all sorts of spruce and fir and pines. These give us vertical structure as well as a good backdrop for the deciduous materials in front of them, a backdrop for the white fence, and good natural movement. Within the garden itself, we have yews that have really been managed as formal landscape elements. Rather than being a hedge, these stand all by themselves for structure and form. And the thing that happens is as the landscape changes in spring, these really assume a different kind of a character. Other evergreens that contribute to the quality of this garden include an arborvitae, which has been pruned into a pointed shape that really mimics the crown on the gazebo. We also have an evergreen holly, kind of a round meatball form with really glossy foliage. And then finally, we have some boxwood, little tiny brighter green boxwood with broadleaf evergreen foliage to them. And what that really does is complement the form of the bigger hollies, but really step down in scale to the gazebo itself. Now what we want to do is go look at some of the deciduous plants that also contribute to this winter landscape. We have a maple behind us, a 3-flower maple, which is kind of unusual, but look at the form of the bark on this. Look at the buds, which are pointed and they're black, and it has just a little bit of foliage left. Sometimes with our deciduous trees and shrubs, it's actually the foliage that remains that also contributes. For example, the hop hornbeam is one of our native plants, and it holds its foliage well into the winter months. Even though it's tan or kind of a brownish color, it's still a little different than the bare structure of the branches of the trees. Ornamental grasses, even though we cut them to the ground in March, are still another thing that sometimes has shrub-like proportions and really contributes as much to the deciduous character or is seen as a foreground or a backdrop to the evergreen materials and gives us that tan color and a lot of the movement and those sorts of things that make the landscape really special during the winter months. We can also choose a lot of different deciduous shrubs that will contribute to the winter landscape with their form, their fruit, berries, seeds, all those kinds of things. One of them is shrub roses. Many of our newer varieties of shrub roses have great ornamental hips that stay on the shrub almost all winter. And even things like dwarf-winged euonymus, which is burning bush, has great fruit character that will contribute to the winter landscape. Also, the ornamental grasses, by virtue of their size and the color and the movement of their plumes, sort of are in between. They're deciduous, but they're big enough to be a shrub, but they're deciduous, so they work with perennials and all those kinds of things, and they really contribute a lot of character to the winter landscape. And if we really know what we're looking at, we can get down and dirty and look at some of the little tiny perennials that we might not even be aware of during the winter months, and it's during the winter that their foliage and those sorts of things even shines to best advantage. So what we're going to do is we're going to go trotting over to a wall that has a wonderful combination of textures, some things that are evergreen, some things that have a character that probably none of us really take time to pay attention to, and see what they do for our winter landscape. One of the great things about a natural laid stone wall is it provides a perfect foil for some of our little tiny plants for the winter landscape, as well as giving them a good growing environment. And in this case, we have a repetition of the boxwood form, the round form that we saw previously, the arborvitae as well, but we also have some neat things like lavender, which is sort of an evergrey plant in our winter landscape. We have some wonderful plants like the large, bold foliage of Bergenia. Common name is pig squeak for people who really think common names are sort of an interesting thing to think about. Over at the end of this wall, and that is a totally different texture than some of the other smaller plants. We have a little plant called roundleaf horehound that would remind people a lot of a lamb's ear, except it's a little teeny weeny thing, and it has kind of a little silvery scalloped edge around each single one of its leaves. That in combination with some of our sun roses, some of the foliage of things like basket of gold, which retains some character in the winter. And even the seed heads of some of the sedums gives us sort of an up-close and personal look at some of our winter landscape plants in this particular instance. From the broad overview of the landscape that includes the fence and the lines of the walk, the backdrop of the evergreen trees, the wonderful texture of the deciduous bark on that maple, all the way down to the little bitty things like the leaves of the roundleaf horehound, we have endless possibilities to create a great winter landscape. We'll look later at some of the other combinations we can use, including more of the grasses, more of the native natural style, and maybe even some more hardscape materials.